All right, everybody, we are live on the YouTubes. Welcome to the Unapologetic Apologists, where we discuss big ideas in apologetics and philosophy. I'm Stelman Smith Jr., and super excited to have my next guest. I've actually appeared on his podcast before. Maybe I'll have to get the link to that, link it in the description, but his YouTube channel is linked in the description. Go subscribe to it. I'm going to bring him in here. Mr. Brass, thank you for being here, sir.
Hello there, everyone. This is Mr. Brass. Glad to see you guys. How are you doing today, my good sir?
Oh, I'm good. I'm trying to get back to uploading regularly on the YouTube channel. It's been crazy for a while now. And yeah, with that, but I guess before we'll get to you, I'll ask you some questions. I'll let you introduce yourself. Just real quick preliminary stuff to let the audience know. If you're new to the channel, like, subscribe, and comment. Commenting is actually the best thing you can do for the YouTube algorithm. And so for this episode, because eventually we'll be talking about the Trinity, not right off the bat, we're going to have everybody comment at Trinity Radio, tag Trinity Radio. We're going to be doing this kind of stuff. It'll be hilarious for Braxton Hunter if he sees his channel name just commented by everybody in the comment section. So comment. And like I said, go subscribe to Mr. Brass. So Mr. Brass, for people who don't know who you are, I guess just get into a brief introduction, and then I'll ask more about your background and your views.
Yeah, basically speaking, I am a deist YouTuber. I've been going at what I've been doing for less than I think maybe 1 or 2 years. I mean, at least on my Mr. Brass channel, I've been around on YouTube probably in general for much longer than that. I would say going on maybe 7 or 8 years on that front. I started my Mr. Brass channel as an attempt to teach and have fun doing so, teaching stuff like the history of religion, teaching some stuff about some philosophy of religion, and I basically just want to create sort of an archive of videos by me where I make content informing people and entertaining people at the same time about matters regarding religion. I'm a big proponent of I'm a big proponent of open dialogue when it comes to, religion's place in society and trying to bring my own ideas forward in politics.
Yeah, no, and we discussed politics. We actually discussed politics a lot before when I appeared on your podcast. So that was a lot of fun. Obviously, we're both conservatives, and so when you say open dialogue, no surprise to me. But I'm sorry, you were about to say something there.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm libertarian, not conservative.
Well, tomato. I guess it depends. I have a lot of libertarian friends, and I mean, I would say I'm a libertarian. I would say I'm a libertarian because I'm a conservative. I would say that part of conservative values include, of course, you're for limited government. I would say it's not very conservative to be, I would say, big government, even if you want to use that big government to cram down right-leaning values. I wouldn't see that as a value of conservatism. But I guess I don't want to go too far down that rabbit trail. I want to kind of mainly focus more on the religious stuff here.
Sure.
So obviously you said you're a deist. So I guess tell us a bit about that. Have you always been a deist? What kind of, I guess, a belief system were you brought up in? And then what kind of led you to deism?
Yes, that is a very good question. I made a video on my YouTube channel where I basically read because I've been engaged in deist circles for a little while now. I basically had written an article for a website called deism.com, where I explained my transitioning from a what I would call a liberal, non-denominational Christian to a deist. Now, basically, for a short summary of what I went through, I basically grew up in a non-denominational liberal Christian household. I mean, I was a big supporter of the Democrats. I was pro-choice the entire time I was Christian.
Well,
I basically, that was my stick, all the way up until eventually, I would say I think maybe in 2019, I would say, what ended up happening to me is I'm very honest with it. I say I had a sort of what people would call a religious experience that sort of made me take religion much more seriously than I had previously done in my entire life. And what ended up happening is that brought me onto a journey where me and John of JMD Apologetics, I discussed this a little bit with him, where I wanted to read the church fathers. I really wanted to affirm my Christian faith at the time. And what ended up happening is it sort of backfired. What ended up happening is I began to see a lot of the variations, like when it came to free will. I seen basically how the church, how a lot of political leanings were diverse in it. And I found also that I couldn't really square religion with a lot of the things, like not religion per se, but I couldn't square my Christian beliefs with just the sheer diversity that I found in Christianity at the time. And I also really couldn't defend it anymore based on the history that I was reading. And I would also say that I had some traumatic events that had occurred to me throughout my life. And eventually that led me to just getting out of Christianity. And when I left Christianity, I never was, I would say, an atheist. I was an agnostic for a little while. And then what happened is that I picked up a book, the Jefferson Bible, and I also picked up a book on the Age of Reason by Thomas Paine. And I said, these guys are talking about deism. And I began to go down that rabbit hole, and I eventually said, you know what? I think deism is the best way, because I found that it took the evidence for atheism, and it took the evidence of, the natural religion, like what they call natural theology. It took both of them, and it made, where it just left with pure deism, because it was being able to account for both. And that's sort of where I where I said, I think deism is the best way to reconcile the evidence from both sides.
Mm-hmm. So would you say what you're, I guess, labeling evidence for atheism would be more fairly categorized as evidence for lack of God's, say, interaction with humanity?
I would say that, for example, the problem of evil, like the more evidential problems of evil, like you would see Graham Oppy bringing up. I also found the divine hiddenness argument by J.L. Schollenberg to be very, very persuasive. What really got me almost to go atheist was reading up on Quentin Smith's arguments against divine causality. But I seen Craig's reply to him on that, and so that didn't really make me go full atheist on that part. But that was sort of, so I took the evidences that I seen, and I also took some of I realized just how ancient deism actually is when you actually look for the roots. People like to say that deism is just a product that came about 200 years ago, when actually it goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. I like to say the Enlightenment thinkers did not really invent anything. They just took concepts that they found in the ancient Greek literature and remade them under a new framework.
Okay.
And that was sort of how it went. Like, basically, deism originates as sort of a hybrid of two different views of Epicureanism, for one, and two, Hellenistic Judaism. And these are both ancient views. It basically is a hybrid of both of them. The Hellenistic Judaism, it gets its roots from because Hellenistic Judaism was very much in line with the oneness of God and the attributes of that, while Epicureanism was about the gods being uninvolved. Epicurus was a polytheist, where he believed that there were multiple gods, but they sort of just, his idea was that they were just so busy having fun and partying in the nether that they didn't have time for us peasants. So they were uninvolved in that way. And Hellenistic Judaism Hellenistic Judaism in specific took a lot of the oneness of God and focused a lot on his divine providence. And it sort of meshed those two together, and the Enlightenment simply took those ideas and just framed them around reason and our use of reason to understand the world. So that's basically deism as a history, a short little history. There have always, like, I would say there are sort of deist denominations in a sense, that they're like sort of like how there is denominations in Christianity. There were English deists and there were French deists who had the English deists were more Christian friendly in the sense that they believed Jesus as a moral teacher, and they believed that God hypothetically might be able to, like some of them didn't say that God intervened per se, but they said that there would be nothing stopping him from intervening if he wanted to. They took that sort of view. While the French deists were just basically openly hostile. Think Voltaire, for example, where he basically was just, he went after everyone. He hated authority, which I love that about him. There's a little thing. But yeah, I sort of found that to be interesting. And of course there are more modern deist variations. Deism, funny enough, is very, what do you call it? It garners a lot of hatred in some Christian scholarly sources, where they literally call it the threat of deism. So, and that has a long tradition in of itself, going both ways between conflicts between the deist and the Christians, and during the French Revolution.
Yeah. So okay, so a couple of questions. And I think that's all fascinating. Of course, I titled the episode "Deism on Trial." I would like to push back a little bit, not too much, because I also obviously want to learn, because you know much more about this than I do.
Sure.
But also I do want to kind of push on some of the ideas if I can. So
Sure.
a lot of different directions we go to. You mentioned obviously the hiddenness problem. I definitely want to touch on that at some point. But something you just mentioned, well, obviously different denominations in deism, but you had previously mentioned that when you're a Christian, this is one of the problems you face, was how do I square my Christianity with all these different denominations? That seemed a problem for you. And it seems to me, though, whatever worldview we're talking about, whatever truth is that we're talking about, there's going to be variations in the way that humans look at it, because, and I'm not being a relativist in this sense, obviously, but just human beings. We were also speaking about how humans were flawed. So, for example, both of us are pro-life. So wherever our moral standards are, we think there's some moral standard that says pro-life is right. But of course, there are many different views on this. Even with among pro-lifers, there are nuanced views. Should there be exceptions in the case of rape? People disagree on that question. Some people say, well, maybe even just up until the baby can feel pain, then ban abortion, but before that, it's okay. So obviously, there's going to be a diversity of views within any view. And so I'm kind of wondering where you would land on that now. If it was a problem for you with Christianity, why wouldn't it be a problem with deism?
Yeah. I mean, and don't get me wrong, that was a bit of a problem that I did notice in deism when I was going into it. That's partially some reasons why I left many deist circles. Not so much of a difference between how do we conceptualize God per se, but there are basically two different, I would say, major, like, besides some of the questions we may ask about how God is, like, there were, I would say, the main two differences between most deists is, on one hand, you would have the very, very vitriolic anti-Christian deist, and the more non-anti-Christian deists like myself. And I don't so much mind different ideas so much, like, because I don't find that they, like, if they don't really essentially contradict the main tenets that you have of it, like, deists will basically, no matter what they say God is, essentially, they do agree on some basic things of him. I found that in Christian denominations, what was sort of different is that, you even had, while Christians like to make it seem even, a lot of times, like, most Christians nowadays would be libertarians in the sense, not politically, but in the sense of free will. Like, but historically, that's not always the case. You had, obviously, Calvinists, and you had even, try to think, oh yeah, Augustine, who was sort of a determinist, or so, depends on how you interpret him. He falls either on the strict theological determinist side, or he falls on the compatibilistic side. Really depends on how you're interpreting him, and how which stage of his life that you're going to. I found that in many cases that even within Christian scholarly literature, like, was Jesus actually crucified on what we call, like, the typical cross symbol, or was he just crucified, like, on a stake sort of thing? That has been a little bit of a debate amongst Christians. They agree that he was crucified. They agreed on that part, but they disagree exactly what it was that he was crucified on. It may have not been strictly a cross. It might have been a stake sort of thing.
That sounds to me, on first glance, I haven't heard it before. It sounds to me like it'd be more of an obscure debate. I mean, are you saying that's more of a modern debate, that's not, like, settled among Christians?
Yeah, I mean, in many cases, and also, the very nature of Jesus himself, there are obviously disagreements amongst Christians on exactly how the Trinity works, and that's a big thing in Christianity. That's sort of, I would say, the crux of modern. I mean, that's sort of the modern crux of the Christianity is like, how does how is there three persons in one God? That's sort of a thing. That's a big thing that many Christians, that it just didn't satisfy me on the terms of the Trinity because most Christians that I know today, I don't know your stance specifically, but many Christians just say it's a mystery and that's it. While some Christians, like I've seen in the literature, argue for a more contradictory notion where, it is contradictory, but that it's not a problem because, I mean, it appears contradictory, but it isn't because God knows more of the information to us. And I find that ultimate to be more semantical because when you go through the contradictory view, it ends up becoming the mystery view. Because essentially, the only difference is it says you have to wait until you go to heaven. But yeah, the squaring the Trinity was something else that I still to this day don't really get. I think that entails some contradictions in terms of virtue ethics. And
that's interesting.
Virtue that people hold. I think deism is better on that because it doesn't apply a lot of the emotional attributes that are typically given into the Christian God.
Okay, well, I guess that's a good transition to the next two questions. So I have a question that kind of goes back over this idea of denominations on the Christianity and in deism, and then kind of transition into the Trinity. Real quick, JMD, this must be a running joke between you guys. Mr. Petty, he calls you.
That's funny. I always call him Petty, and that goes back to how he invited me onto a stream. Well, maybe not a stream, but a discussion that he was having with this dude. I can't remember his name, but the dude was just getting really angry at JMD because JMD kept asking him what is logic, and he just said, "You're very petty." And once that ended, I texted JMD on Messenger, and I said, "How you doing, Mr. Petty?" And that's been a running gag between me and him ever since.
There you go. And he says, no offense, Frank Turek has 512 more views than you right now. I made a big mistake. I didn't realize Frank Turek was live at the moment. So that explains why I have far less views. But that is okay because that means if people are watching this archived, obviously you can't comment when a video is live. So if you're watching this archive, comment. It's the best thing you can do for the algorithm. Obviously subscribe, like, and share, but comment. And the word of the day is at Trinity Radio, because we're about to be discussing the Trinity with Mr. Brass. So tag at Trinity Radio in the comments just to troll Braxton. I can't wait to see his reaction if he messages me and is like, what is up with this?
Obviously you're trolling him because you stole his hairstyle.
Yes. Although I don't have the luscious beard Braxton has. But so to go back, so you kind of made the case, though, okay, there's different ideas in deism, but they have the same core tenets. Well, I would argue the same is true of Christianity. Even if there's debates about how the Trinity works, there's not a debate in the Christian sense of that the Trinity is an essential part of the Christian faith, that Jesus is God, that he died for our sins, that by trusting in him, we can have eternal life in his name. Even if the Calvinists and the Libertarians have a disagreement on how it is we can come to faith in God and whether or not we were predestined to it, whether or not we even have the libertarian faith, that there's still the central core tenets of us trusting in him, whatever that means, is the means by which we attain salvation. And I would say anybody who would say, well, I don't think Jesus actually was God, but somehow he died for our sins, or thinks that there's some alternative way into heaven other than through Jesus, they're really, I wouldn't call that a denomination of Christianity. They're excluded from Christianity. They wouldn't fit of what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity. And so I would even say that there's these main ideas within Christianity that you kind of do have to accept, even if you might have some disagreement about the means there.
So like Mormonism and Jehovah's Witness. when have you accepted Joseph Smith as your Lord and Savior?
Yeah, no, of course not. I would exclude. I mean, I'm always when we discuss things like that, it's like Catholics, right?
Oh
So
yeah,
for example, I think I view a lot of Catholics the way basically my whole thing is I'm going to distinguish between the individual and then the belief system in itself. The belief system in and of itself of Mormonism is not Christian. Just period. Of Jehovah's Witnesses as a whole is not Christian. Now, when you look at Catholics, I view Catholics often as a lot of, I would say, more peaceful Muslims, where they sincerely they kind of hold this view, but they've never really paid any attention to the core tenets of it, right? Like Catholics don't necessarily think about all the things about praying to the saints or all these things. It's kind of just like they're raised in that culture. They don't pay attention to the core tenets, but they have a essential faith in Jesus. And I would say on the individual level, if their faith is primarily in Jesus, like obviously a Catholic can be saved. So I don't want to look at a specific Mormon and say, well, I know for a fact that you haven't trusted in Jesus. Maybe they've just kind of been raised in a Mormon household, don't really know hardly anything about it, but they've trusted in Jesus. So I'm kind of making that distinction there between the individual and the
that's fair.
system as a whole. But yes, I would say Mormonism, the system as a whole, I don't think is Christian.
Yeah, that's sort of fair. I remember we were going to go on the Trinity, and what my sort of objection to it was.
Yeah. Can I say something just as a preliminary part to that,
Sure.
and then I'll let you kind of give your thing? Because
Sure.
I remember watching your clip when Braxton Hunter included it in his video. I think you said, I think the words you used were, it was absurd. I think that was it. And I just want to say, just kind of as the preliminary context for this discussion, I don't think there's anything contradictory about the Trinity unless one, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but unless one has kind of a presupposition of physicalism, where a person is synonymous with their being. Like me as a person, my ambitions, my thoughts, my dreams, all of that stuff is synonymous with my being. Now, if that's the case, if physicalism is true and all of that is the same thing, then yeah, I would say a notion like the Trinity would be contradictory, because it'd be essentially saying there's one person and three persons, or one being and three beings, right? That would obviously be contradictory and absurd. I don't think that's the case. I think if we at least have an idea where, in at least some sense, a person can be separate from the being, not separated as pulled in two parts, but whereas me, Michael, the person, is not the same as my being, my essence, I think it at least opens up the door for possibility that makes it at least not absurd. And to illustrate, I had this idea of, like, suppose I traveled to another planet in another galaxy, right? Mm-hmm. And on that planet, I found the beings there that either had evolved or God had created had one body but two heads, let's say. And let's say in these two heads are two separate brains, and these are two separate persons, but for all intents and purposes, that's considered one being, and it is, right? It's one being, but there's two persons that exist in that being. And then suppose in that same galaxy I go to yet another planet, and there you don't even have the two separate heads. Maybe you just have two separate brains in one head. Maybe they look just like us, but there's two brains, and then there's two persons, two souls, if you will, inside this one being. And so I think just saying that as kind of an illustration, and then even if I came back and told you, hey, yeah, there's these creatures on this other planet and they're two souls in one being, you might not believe me. You might say, I want more proof than your word. And I would say that's fair enough, but I don't think you could just disregard it as absurd or contradictory. I think so long as we can have an idea that a person isn't synonymous with the being, that at least opens up the door for the possibility.
Yeah, what you're talking about sort of sounds like how William Lane Craig in his, I can't remember, I think maybe it was William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland in their book on natural theology. I can't remember for the life of me what it's called, but they give sort of the Cerberus analogy.
Sorry, is this one?
That's it.
Yeah. There you go. Bam.
Yeah, that's the book. Where I believe in that book they give the like what you said, but they phrase it as the Cerberus argument.
Is Cerberus the three-headed dog? Because I think I might have heard that analogy before.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, so obviously I'd want to be careful to say that these hypothetical aliens I'm speaking of, or the dog, is not obviously a perfect analogy to the Trinity. I want to be clear of that. But I do think it at least illustrates the possibility.
Well, yeah. A Muslim apologist, Shabir Ali, in his speech, because he had read the book too, and he brought up a problem with that because, Cerberus is three persons. They just happen to be attached to each other. But I mean, that would be sort of odd to say that, like, that'd be sort of like saying that God, Jesus, and they're all different from each other. They have different attitudes to each other. But Christians generally don't really say that about Jesus and the Holy Trinity.
Right, because they're not physical beings.
Yeah, so what I found sort of funny about, so my objection more to the Trinity comes from the idea of virtues that one has. And I would say that, virtues, how I would define their dispositions for living a flourishing life. And I think that the type of being that one is and the type of person one is, they have to, there's certain virtues that they're capable of displaying. The Trinity, I find, is contradictory in the sense that there are certain virtues that God cannot have, because what I like to call them, they are negative virtues, in the sense that in order to have the virtue, you have to have some defect on your part in order to obtain that virtue. For
Okay, so could you give? Okay, I was about to ask for an example. You're already ahead of me there.
Yeah. So, for example, a virtue of courage, for example. Well, courage, I mean, what is courage? Courage is basically bravery in the face of danger, right?
Sure.
Courage is completely predicated on being in danger, right? If you're never in danger, you can't be courageous because there's nothing for you to be courageous towards. That's and I say it's sort of contradictory in the sense that God can never be in danger because obviously God is powerful, and God is not, God obviously is not like Hercules in the sense where there are beings more powerful than him that can pose a challenge to him and slay him.
Sure.
But it's contradictory to the Trinity because for one, it grants that God and Jesus, they share this relationship, but yet they have, on one hand, they are both virtuous. I mean, they are both courageous and not courageous at the same time, which seems to be a contradiction. Because it means something to say, for example, that I'm courageous, that there was an angry mob at my house, and instead of just fleeing, I organized a bunch of people that were around me, grabbed my guns, and I stood up to the mob, right?
Yeah.
That would be courageous on my part, but that is a sort of situation that God could never find himself in. That's a situation only humans and maybe some aliens somewhere else could experience. So you have Jesus, where you can say he's facing courage in a sense, because he's dealing with the Romans and Jews that want him dead, and he's still defying them in spite of that, while also saying that he's God, who categorically cannot be in danger, and thus feel courage.
So here I'm going to push back a little bit. So I don't see why that's a contradiction. So, for example, you're talking about courage, and you're talking about how courage can kind of only exist kind of in this face of danger. And I think, look, fair enough. But my thing is you have to ask, what's the meta virtue that underlies courage? And so it's going to be something like standing for the truth even in the face of danger. And so the idea is you could have the idea of, well, I'm going to put my foot down and I'm going to stand for truth. And that could apply whether you're in danger or not in danger. And so God, as a being, is going to display all the meta virtues, right? So he's going to be infinitely good. He's going to be infinitely standing for truth. And then it so happens that when he puts on, when the second person of the Trinity puts on, and this is why, again, when you make that distinction between the persons and the being, this actually, to me, helps with the contradictions and gets rid of the contradictions. And the reason is because when you're making that distinction between the persons, God, the person of the Father isn't feeling danger. The person of Jesus is feeling danger, so no contradiction because two different persons, right? But you could say what's common, where this is common in the essence, is the standing for truth. And one of the persons is standing for the truth and actually has the threat of danger, and so it manifests as courage, whereas the person of the Father is standing for truth, and maybe he's not in danger, so it doesn't manifest the same way, but the same meta virtue is underlying the being as a whole, and so underlies both the person's actions.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, although I would push back and say that a big thing in courage is that it's obviously a risk. There's a risk involved in, that's not the only one that's sort of just an example. There are obviously philosophers go dozens and dozens of virtues. This is simply one that, most people know about. It's a lot easier for me to talk about courage than say temperance or fidelity or stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that I would push back a little bit on that front by saying that there obviously is a risk. Like me, for example, standing up in front of, let's say, a group of 5-year-olds who are just saying mean things at me. There's no risk to me in that.
Sure.
Say, I'm standing here for truth, justice, and values. In a group of 5-year-olds, there's no risk involved.
Sure.
Whereas, God's not taking a risk when he says, I'm standing for truth. And that's sort of, that's what courage is. It's sort of taking a sort of risk. But, God obviously isn't taking risk. God is
he's not taking risk in the sense that he's taking a chance, right? Like he doesn't know if danger is going to befall him, right? So he knows danger is going to befall him. I would say he is taking risk in the sense, if you say risk doesn't mean chance, but just means the threat of danger, because there's not only the threat of danger to the son being physically embodied and being physically able to be killed, but there's also, I would say, the threat of danger to the father in losing his son and the pain and the heartbreak of his son being killed.
Well, technically, it would also be him being killed as well. If you're going to the
no, because you're killing the essence that the son has taken on, a physical form that the father has not taken on.
Mm-hmm.
So they're still connected in spirit, and the spirit isn't. The spirit would be the common thing. What would you say? Because Jesus has a bodily essence and a divine essence, and the divine essence isn't being killed. So the father's not being killed in any sense.
Yeah. I mean, I'd also say that, a typical thing some Christians would actually push back is they would actually, I'm actually surprised you take that approach, because the usual approach that I get from many Christians is they'll grant me wholesale, but they'll say that, well, Jesus wasn't really taking a chance either or a risk, because he knew no matter what, he was going to be resurrected. So he wasn't really facing danger in the ultimate sense that
I would say that just doesn't make any sense to me. Again, the word risk I don't like, because it implies this idea of chance, like Jesus doesn't know what's going to happen. Obviously, we would agree that, of course, he knows what's going to happen. I would say this idea that he's not in any real danger because he's going to rise again 3 days later. I'd say, I can only speak for myself, but I would say even if I know for a fact that God is going to raise me from the dead in 3 days, I would still be terrified out of my skull if I knew I was going to suffer the kind of brutal death that Jesus did. Like, to me, it's not much of a consolation, at least while I'm being tortured, that I'm going to be resurrected again. It's like, that's not making this hurt any less.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I've said Christians have typically argued. Like, I pose that because they say that gets rid of the contradiction. Because they would say, all right, we grant you that there's a risk. Like, we grant that courage means taking a risk and facing danger. We grant that wholesale. But in order to avoid that contradiction, we're just going to say, well, Jesus didn't really take an ultimate risk. He just basically said, this is what Christians have told me in order to get out of it. They say, well, Jesus knew that he was...
need to do that.
He knew that he was going to raise from the dead. So, and he knew that not just was he going to be raised from the dead, but that he was going to be given an immortal body, the spiritual body. And so some people, like some Christians that, in order to reconcile that, they'll say, well, Jesus wasn't really taking a risk because he knew that he was going to rise again. Now, obviously, I don't find that very, like, me and you both probably agree that's not a very persuasive argument to avoid it.
Sure.
But I was just saying that's what many Christians have typically given me as a way out. They say, all right, we grant you that God can't take a risk. Like, he can't be harmed. He can't be, like, he can't have those sort of virtues, but Jesus didn't have them either. That's basically their argument. So there's no contradiction because they're one and the same thing. Now, obviously, me and you both would say that that would not be a way to argue out of it if you were going to.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and this is why I see it actually as a an advantage of the Trinity versus something like deism. Whereas on deism, and especially if God never incarnates, then not only do you have God without those virtues, but that God can't even possibly take on those virtues. Whereas in Christianity, God has, again, all of the virtues, all of the meta virtues. He's ultimately loving, ultimately good, ultimately just, and also in the incarnation can manifest those things even in the face of danger, which allows those virtues to now manifest as courage. And so it affects the human nature in such a way where it affects Jesus. And so as God incarnate, taking on the virtue of courage, and then what's being common among all the persons, the divine nature. And so God, as an essence, yes, can manifest courage.
Yeah, I yours is probably a much better explanation that I usually get. What I did find is that deism seeks ultimately to preserve God's providence and his power. And what deism tries to do really is that when we exclude certain things of virtues, we're not seeing that as sort of a detract, where we're making God less than. Instead, we're getting rid of those things so God can be powerful. Like, obviously, it would be stupid to say that God, not being able to create a square circle is somehow less than.
Right.
Because in order for God, because God is logical, he's a logical being, and he can't actualize a contradiction. But we wouldn't say that detracts from God.
Of course.
As sort of a lesser than. So when a deist simply says that God doesn't have a virtue, it's sort of like that. It's not because he's lesser than. It's because that in order for him to have that virtue would entail, in some sense, a sort of contradiction in of itself. Because
he'd have to be a quasi being, right? He couldn't be all powerful if he's actually in threat of something.
Yeah, so it's not, it's not sort of making God lesser than. It's sort of like I was saying, it's sort of like, with the whole square, God being able to create a square circle sort of thing. It's not lesser than. It's not lesser for God to not be able to create a square circle because it's an absurd proposition.
Right. Or in my view, it's not lesser for God not to be able to sin, right? Because that would mean he would have to lack goodness or lack, say, the ability to resist temptation. So to me, it's not God being less than because he's not able to sin. It's because he's maximally good. It's because he doesn't lack anything and can be tempted, right?
Yeah, that's where I go with,
Yeah.
what I would say negative virtues is that
Yeah.
it's not lesser for God to not have these virtues, because
Mm-hmm.
in order for God to have those virtues would require him to be defective.
Yeah. Well,
And,
so let me make an argument here, because here I would say, and I would agree, in my view, God is also not lesser at threat. Now, to me, that doesn't exclude the ability to take on a human nature, where that human nature is at threat to these things without his overall divine essence still not being. I think I said that right. He can take on a human nature that is at threat of things like danger, whereas if the overall divine essence is not at threat of those things. So I still think, even on my view, you get the best of both worlds, where his divine nature isn't at threat and isn't lesser than, but he can take on a human form that is a threat to these things. But I think maybe you could make that argument with some virtues, but it seems to me it's going to be hard to get out of things if you want to have a God that's essentially all good to eliminate love, because love would have to be one of these things, right? Because, and this is, now maybe you have a way of getting around this, like a certain B theory of time or something like that. But, one of the arguments made about the Trinity is, in order for God to be eternally loving, there has to be a relationship for love to exist. There has to be a context for that love to exist. And so with the Trinity, you have the three persons, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and they're eternally able to love one another in a relationship. Whereas if God is completely singular in person, he can't love anything until he creates something to be loved. But of course, that might even be problematic for the deistic concept in and of itself. You
well,
tell me.
I mean, well, a problem that I've always taken with that sort of argument is it sort of makes God he needs love. Like, and I would say, obviously we would say it'd be sort of like this, like God needs a relationship with human beings.
I don't think it does.
Yeah, and that's sort of where many critics of that, like that's sort of, I think, the objection to that some Muslim apologetics have to that sort of view, because they think that if you say that, that the Trinity, provides this loving circle, that it sort of necessitates that God needs this, whereas, and which seems to contradict the notion that God really needs anything.
So I want to be careful. I'm not saying God needs, say, to be loved, for example. I'm saying that, and I wouldn't even say God needs it. I would say in the same thing where we might want to agree that, say, a necessary attribute of God is that he's all powerful, for example. I would want to say a necessary attribute of God is that he's all loving. And so my argument isn't that he needs to be loved by another being in the Trinity, but that if it's a necessary attribute that he's all loving, there has to exist a context in which that love can occur.
Well, I mean, also, a typical one would also grant is that obviously a singular person can love themselves, and not, and like some people say, well, that's narcissistic. No, it isn't. I mean, if you hate yourself, that's far worse than if you love yourself, and that only requires one person.
Well, okay, fair enough. I mean, there's obviously can be a narcissistic love and a more virtuous self-love. Self-love doesn't have to be narcissistic.
So, I would say that the Trinity does. I mean, but I don't think love has to be per se relational. It can be confined to one singular person. Like, I don't need, for example, a family to love. I can love myself.
Yeah, it's not the same kind of love, though. And I think, though, the kind of the love we want to attribute to God as a necessary attribute isn't kind of this self-love. I'm not the best to speak at this. A guy like Josh Rasmussen would speak to it better, because he can actually speak at the different kinds of love. For example, I once asked him why 3 persons instead of 2, and he gave me this good explanation of, well, there's a kind of love that can exist between 2 persons, but there's an even greater kind of love that can exist if you kind of have a third person in there. So I'm not going to be able to articulate it well, but I think the kind of love that I want to attribute to God as a necessary attribute, it extends beyond this kind of self-love.
Yeah, and a typical, also another response is, wouldn't that also extend to pagan gods? Because obviously pagan gods love each other in some senses.
Sure, but I mean, insofar as we both might agree for kind of arguments for a necessary foundation to reality, we would agree that excludes pagan gods, so that wouldn't necessarily be a problem there.
Yeah, I'm just saying that's sort of where a Muslim apologist would go towards, because they would say that's sort of like a pagan belief, that because pagan gods are
See.
relational.
Oh, I see. I mean, yeah, I just don't. I would try to say to the Muslim that seems like a red herring to me. I don't think me arguing that uh, we need some kind of explanation for why God, as a necessary being, should exhibit the attribute of being loving, all loving. Um,
Mhm.
how that's analogous to paganism in any way.
Well, they would say it's damn it, analogous in the sense that, it's relational sort of thing. Like,
Oh, sure, but I mean, it's not a refutation to the point, though.
yeah,
To say, oh, well, the pagans also believe that. It's like, okay, but the pagans also get a lot of things. They get some things right. I mean, I might say fair enough, pagans, if you want to say that your gods can be all loving because there's this relationship between all of them. I'd say fair enough, but most of your other beliefs are wrong.
yeah, that's just sort of a typical thing that they usually do. Um, I use the virtue argument, and like I said, a lot of it's good that you actually disagree with Christians that oppose me on that point. Is that, like I said, they usually go for the explanation that, oh well, like I said, that they just go for the explanation that God is, Jesus didn't really suffer or something like that, which obviously me
Yeah.
and you just, you obviously
Well,
disagree with.
so here's a question though. So would your problems with the Trinity more have to do with the incarnation and not just the concept of the Trinity of itself? Because again, I don't see an argument that there's something incoherent about, so long as we can agree, or at least agree that there's a possibility of a concept of persons being separate from beings, that you could have multiple persons in one being. So it doesn't seem to me like that's the problem. It seems to me like more so the problem might be something that there might be these contradictions when it comes to the incarnation.
I think it's the point really comes down to more or less preserving God's uh, power and providence and sort of that sort of way, and
Okay.
not trying, in my opinion, to anthropomorphize, make God a human.
Oh
Um,
well, I mean, I could give an argument here.
mhm,
So we want to agree that God is all powerful, that He has complete control over human history. Um, so one thing I might argue is that, let's say, like I believe, God is all powerful. He's sovereign over human history, and he desires the kinds of creatures that aren't merely, I would say, kind of pets in a terrarium that he just kind of creates to make happy and make comfortable. That he wants creatures that can be morally mature, and so that's going to necessitate experiencing some kind of suffering, right? You can't have morally mature creatures unless they can, like you said, exercise the virtue of courage in the face of danger, right? So he wants morally mature creatures that can develop these virtues, and he wants a relationship with them, and that's going to involve suffering. And it seems to me that God knows that, again, one of the things that's going to have to happen is, if he gives these creatures freedom, that what's going to happen is they're going to fall, because he can't force them to use freedom for good all the time, right? The kind of the typical story here. God gives them freedom because that's one of the ultimate virtues, right? It's the first virtue. Without freedom, you can't love, you can't be courageous, you can't do any of it, right? So that's the first virtue, but he can't guarantee they're always going to choose good. So they sin, they fall. And then I would say that, though, if we're going to take the incarnation out of the picture, well, this actually limits God's sovereignty over, well, now there's no way to reconcile them to himself, right? He created them, he gave them freedom because that was the ultimate good, and they used it to turn away from him, and now they're separated from him, and now that's just stuck. And so to me, I see it again as attributing to the power of God and attributing or adding to the sovereignty of God, that even then he still has a way to be sovereign over his plan, that he can take on human flesh, live the perfect life in our place, die for us, and then that provides the means by which we can be reconciled. So he remains sovereign over the whole story of human history, providing us the way, whereas the alternative seems that he's limited, that once we fall away from him, it's like, well, shoot, I can't get him back.
Um, I found, I believe I sent you that PDF file. You want to pull that up
Mm-hmm.
for the audience?
Yeah. I'm assuming it's relevant to what I just said. Do you know where that section might be?
Well, I mean, I was figuring that we would, I was thinking like moving on a little bit,
Oh, okay.
because,
So move on from the point I just made.
yeah.
Okay. So fair enough. real quick before I bring it up, unless it's going to touch on this, I do have one more thing I want to ask you, if that's okay.
Sure. Go ahead.
So obviously you and I would probably agree on most arguments for God, right? That don't necessitate his involvement in human history, right? Like I think the resurrection is an argument from God, but we obviously would probably disagree on some of this stuff.
Yeah.
But I would assume, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that we would probably agree more on stuff like the Kalam argument, like the fine-tuning argument, and these might be things that are consistent with both theism and deism.
Yeah.
One question I did have is, how do you feel about, I would say, I don't have the book right over here with me, Ed Feser's arguments. I don't know if you've read the 5 proofs or have listened to Ed Feser talk about it or not, but for example, the Aristotelian proof, which at first glance seems like the kind of Kalam argument or other arguments. But when you realize that not only does God have to kind of be this first cause, but he also has to be kind of this first layer of cause for everything currently. And so I wonder if that would be inconsistent with your form of deism to say not only does God have to be kind of the first domino, but he has to be a sustaining cause for everything here and now. So he has to constantly be involved for creation, not to just fall apart at any moment.
I have heard of Ed Feser. I haven't got a chance to read his books. So I wouldn't know how to respond to the argument because
fair enough.
From what I've said to from what I've seen of the argument, it's like I don't know, like dozens of premises.
50 premises, yes.
Yeah. So I wouldn't know particularly which premise to attack. Because it would probably take me for an hour or two just to read all the premises and understand the jargon.
Fair enough.
I don't want to straw man his arguments.
Would it be okay if I presented it very briefly? I mean, not all the premises, but just kind of gave the layout of the argument, and you could see if there's anything there that you just kind of find unsettling.
Well, what I always find funny about Christians that do use Aristotelian proofs is that they seem to forget who Aristotle was himself. Aristotle himself was obviously a pagan.
Sure.
And for another part of it is that, for one, it was sort of funny, his belief is that he believed in the immortality, he didn't believe in the immortality of the soul, although he did believe in a soul. Yeah, but I also found that he was a sort of a deist in his own time because the sort of God that Aristotle believed in and what he believed followed logically through his contingency argument was not a God that you pray to. That wasn't a God that Aristotle believed in. Basically, all Aristotle's original contingent God was he was basically the one that organizes it all. And, so I think one could say that, there's nothing would be wrong to saying that if God did want, since God obviously had the power to create the universe, that in some way he sustains it in the sense that his power is always present, in the sense that if I use my labor, for example, to make a car, well, my handiwork is always going to be present in that car. So you can say that is what lives on, in the sense.
Yeah, so that wouldn't be the direction he goes. And here's the thing, fair enough about Aristotle's beliefs, but I wouldn't find it compelling for the same reason I don't find it compelling when Matt Dillahunty says, well, I find it funny how Christians will quote Bart Ehrman up until the point where he disagrees with the resurrection. It's like, well, hold on, Bart Ehrman can not believe in the resurrection, but get other things historically accurate about Jesus, and it's not unfair for us to quote those things. And so with Aristotle, regardless of what his ultimate beliefs were, I don't think it's unfair for us to quote where we think he got right and to develop his arguments maybe past where he even thought they were able to go.
I often, I consider Aristotle, I call Aristotle my homeboy, as a sort of a loving thing. I always find it funny with him is that I do criticize him myself because he seemed also like he had a virtue ethical approach but yet he seemed to completely miss the ball when it came to applying that to women and slaves. So I find nothing particularly wrong with saying, all right, Aristotle had these beliefs, but he wasn't ultimately taking them to their logical conclusion.
Yeah. So here's the analogy of the Aristotelian proof, though, because for example, I would say it would be a fine analogy for deism to say you build a car, right, and then you're just kind of, and you can say, yeah, well, yeah, the evidence of your handiwork is there, but you're really not involved after you sell it to the customer. And so even though there's evidence of your handiwork, that's still consistent with a deistic kind of analogy, right? But I would say a more theistic analogy that would be less compatible with deism was like you build a car, but then let's say, a year goes by and something falls off and you rush back in to fix that part, right? The person calls you back on the phone, and then another thing breaks and you go and you fix that part. And then maybe you're just, to keep it from breaking, you're just visiting once a month and doing regular maintenance on the car. That would obviously be more compatible with theism. And the Aristotelian proof is more along those lines, where it's not only God as a first cause, but as a continuous cause. And so it would look more like this, right? So he defines change as the actualization of potential, right? So like water doesn't have to be cold, right? That's a potential. And then there's an actualization of it that lies beyond the water, right? So the water can't make itself cold. There's something that lies beyond it, which is the temperature in the room. But then the temperature in the room is only a potential. Maybe that was actualized by the turning on of the air conditioner. But the air conditioner being on, again, was only a potential that had to be actualized outside of something, or something outside of itself, which is the person flipping it on, and so on, so on. And this is the idea of linear change, right? Where it's like the actualization of potential has to be actualized by something outside of the thing in of itself. And then Ed Feser grants, for sake of argument, which I wouldn't even necessarily grant, he grants for sake of argument that this could go on infinitely, this idea of linear change, right? So this kind of successive potential. And he says, okay, suppose we allow that to go on infinitely. But then he introduces hierarchical change. And hierarchical change isn't linear in the sense that it's event after event. It's even if you freeze a moment in time. So you freeze this moment in time. This microphone doesn't have to be right here. It's only a potential, and it's actualized by the table or this desk holding it up. But this desk being right here is only a potential, which is actualized by the floor being the way it is, which is actualized by the foundations of this. And then you can keep going. And then the earth being, where it is, or there being, say, stone under us and not sand, and then the earth, and then the solar system and gravity. And you get all these things. So even if you freeze a moment in time, and it turns out that if you stretch that all the way back, that it can't just be an infinite succession of finite, only potential causes, right? So it has to land somewhere in an unactualized actualizer. The same reason that if you say you had a painting, and you say what actualized the potential of that, and you had the paintbrush, and then you had the handle, which actualized the potential of the bristles being where they are, and you just extended that handle infinitely long, that wouldn't solve anything, because you'd still have to have an explanation for the potential of that handle. And so it's only until you get something that's an unactualized actualizer, which we call God. And the reason, and the point is that has to exist for any given moment in time, not just kind of like I said, a first domino that sets everything else into order. Because in order for this microphone to be here right now, there has to be an unactualized actualizer. In order for me to be sitting here speaking to you right now, there has to be an unactualized actualizer. And so God is actualizing things at every given moment. And I would personally argue that's more compatible with theism, but I wonder your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I always do find that interesting, although I would say that, to me, I think it would really depend on how far you go when it comes to dependence. It's sort of like saying, for example, my being born, for example, obviously you can trace that back to my parents. But, once my parents have set me into motion, whatever causes that I do are ultimately individualized to me.
Sure.
So I would sort of see that sort of my parents could, for all could have abandoned me, but you could still trace me back to them.
Mm-hmm.
But, I would sort of say that's sort of, all I would say is that really gets you, it wouldn't, I don't think, get you to that God is like, saying like for me picking up a bar of soap that means God is making me pick up the bar of soap. I think it more would less go to like,
No.
I mean, it would be more or less like my parents, just because they bore me and they played a hand in me, like, you know, in the sense that me picking up my bar of soap, that if they hadn't had sex, then I wouldn't be able to be here to pick up this bar of soap. So they can say that they had a hand in that sort of sense, but
Sure,
that
but
wouldn't.
the point of the Aristotelian proof is to say that that it's not analogous to this kind of parent argument, where God is, again, like your parents, just kind of a first cousin bringing you about, and then even if your parents died, you would still continue. The whole point of like, yes, your parents aren't making you pick up a bar of soap. God isn't making you pick up a bar of soap, but God is presently and currently, not just a first domino, but presently sustaining a universe in which there can be a bar of soap there, and in which you can exist as an individual to have a free choice to pick up and the ability to pick up that bar of soap. Whereas if God, the argument is kind of, if God took his hands off, the whole universe would just fall apart.
Yeah, I do think there might be some merit in that. I think that, you know, ultimately, have you ever heard of existential inertia?
Yes, but I'm drawing a blank on the definition right now.
Oh,
I know
good.
what you're talking about, though. It came up in Ed Fazer and Graham Oppie's debate.
Yeah, you know, so, you know, I'm not obviously an expert when it comes to actually being able to define that, but, you know, from what I've seen with Ed Fazer and sort of and Graham Oppie, I always found that, you know, I think that, you know, I would have to really go through the Ed Fazer's, because I don't want to straw man him.
No, fair enough.
So I want to, you know, I do clearly want, you know, so I wouldn't be able to have a particularly coherent world. You know, I wouldn't be able to make a good counter refute without reading his work.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I do think it is interesting. I think it just all goes down to how you view, for one, how you view time and causation and changes.
Sure. Yeah. I'm a rather.
Ed Fazer is an atheist of time. He's a presentist.
As am I.
Yeah. He obviously has disagreements with Ed. I mean, I can't remember. Robert Koons, I think his name is, who is, I think, a B theorist. Who he often says that Aristotelianism can be compatible with the B theory. So ultimately, it would all come down to how you define those terms.
Sure.
But yeah, I would have to look more into it in order to see how compatible they would be and would not be. But yeah, I definitely think it is interesting. I know we come up on the hour mark, and you said you wanted to be out by 9.
Yeah, we are 15 minutes over. Very briefly, I mean, maybe we should do another episode, because I do want to ask about what you think of the evidence for the resurrection, as well as, I know I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, the divine hiddenness, because you brought up. So it probably would be best to save those, do another episode where we get into those, because those could take quite a while to discuss. So yeah, I guess if you want to leave any parting thoughts with the audience, obviously your YouTube channel is linked in the description. People, please go check it out, subscribe there. But Mr. Brest, is there anything you want to leave the audience with?
Yes, I want to say, you know, check out my channel. Obviously, the links will be in the description. I would say I had a very fun time discussing, you know, theology, philosophy, and, you know, where me and you sort of get into it. It will be interesting to talk about the resurrection. You know, I have actually been thinking about doing a video on that topic. So, you know, in the future we can do that, and, you know, I'll obviously collect my notes so I can have ready responses. And, you know, it can be a good debate. Maybe we can also talk, maybe in a different sort of podcast after that, we can talk about politics or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. We have fun conversations about that. And you know, I'm quite politically driven. I don't speak on it too much on the YouTube channel, just because I feel like I'd want to be, you know, more on the level of education of, you know, guys that I watch, like Steven Crowder, Ben Shapiro, which I'll never be quite at their level, but, you know.
Yeah, I definitely see that. I know that's sort of why Michael Inspiring Philosophy doesn't do that on his channel. Well, with one exception where he actually did a video on abortion.
Yeah.
which is political issues. But he says he purposely he doesn't do political videos because he doesn't want to cause a division between politically left and politically right Christians.
Yeah, no, fair enough. But like you said, with the exception of that topic, I'm okay causing a division between Christians who are pro-life and pro-choice. I think, yeah, to me, I'm okay with that. If I make pro-choice Christians uncomfortable, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But yeah. So anyway, yes, please go over to Mr. Brass's YouTube channel. Again, in the description is real easy. Just scroll down, find that link, go subscribe there. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, subscribestar.com/TUA is where you can go to support this ministry. Working 2 jobs right now and working on, obviously, the YouTube channel is an extra thing for me, and then some other behind the scenes stuff that I can't quite talk about right now. It's really busy, and I would like to be able to, do this more full time to grow the channel, put more effort into it. But understandably, if you can't, what you can do for absolutely free is to subscribe to the YouTube channel, click like, and like I said, best thing you can do for the YouTube algorithm is comment. Today's word of the day is at Trinity Radio tag, at Trinity Radio Troll Braxton Hunter. It will be hilarious. I want to see a message on my phone from him that says, dude, why is everybody tagging me in the comments of your latest video? But it'll be great. And until next time, thank you, Mr. Brass, for being here.
Yep.